So thank you for that, Gina. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Tell the Israelites to designate the cities of refuge as I instructed you through Moses, so that anyone who kills a person accidentally and unintentionally may flee there and find protection from the avenger of blood. When they flee to one of these cities, they are to stand in the entrance of the city gate and state their case before the elders of that city. Then the elders are to admit the fugitive into their city and provide a place to live among them. If the avenger of blood comes in pursuit, the elders must not surrender the fugitive, because the fugitive killed their neighbor unintentionally and without malice aforethought. They are to stay in that city until they have stood trial before the assembly, and until the death of the high priest who is serving at that time. Then they may go back to their own home in the town from which they fled." So they set apart Kedesh in Galilee in the hill country of Naphtali, Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, and Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the hill country of Judah. East of the Jordan, on the other side from Jericho, they designated Bezer in the wilderness, on the plateau in the tribe of Reuben, Ramoth in Gilead in the tribe of Gad, and Golan in Bashan in the tribe of Manasseh. Any of the Israelites or any foreigner residing among them who killed someone accidentally could flee to these designated cities and not be killed by the avenger of blood prior to standing trial before the assembly. This is the word of God. Thanks be to God.
Let's pray. Loving God, as we consider your word this morning, would you speak to our hearts and minds? Amen. I'm quite impressed in your timings because you're not far out. I was thinking, we'll be cutting the sermon at this rate. I'm quite impressed. So, as far as I know, Joshua 20 wasn't given to me just randomly, just to kind of go, well, that's an interesting reading, we'll give that to her this week. But you're going through Joshua. So you kind of know the context, but it's worth remembering that this reading comes to a group of people who live in a land that was fought over, is fought over. However, you read the beginning of Joshua and the accounts of bloodshed, how extreme they are, whether that is accurate, whether that is hyperbole, whether that's whatever's going on there. There was violence, there was death, there was war to gain the land. The cities of refuge are first outlined in Numbers 35, and in there's more detail given about what constitutes murder as opposed to manslaughter or accidental killing. It seems to me significant that Joshua is designating these lands at this time after bloodshed and war, because it's important to set boundaries, to break the kind of normalization of violence and death, and to set new parameters for this community. After World War II, the United Nations established the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And not long after, the European Court of Human Rights. In the aftermath of war, the leaders recognized the need to establish very clear boundaries and laws around the treatment of others, and particularly protection of those fleeing from persecution and war. So God instructs the Israelites to set aside cities for this very purpose. He didn't say any city, he sets aside specific cities. And those cities are to be the ones that are the Levitical cities, the Levites. Those in charge of worship are to be the cities where people seek sanctuary. God cares about justice, and he expects the Levites, the holy priests, to care about justice too. So God has provided land for the Levites because their job was to run the worship, not work the land. But he also allocates some of those cities to be the cities of sanctuary. These cities are, from what I've read, I'm no geographical expert, were set on hills mainly, because then they were easy to spot. You knew where you were heading. But it reminded me of Jesus. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Now, Jesus said this when he was talking about the disciples being salt and light in Matthew 5. Justice is God's concern, and it should be the disciples' concern too. Our concern for justice, our concern for the person seeking sanctuary, makes us visible as God's disciples, as Jesus' disciples. And not just justice, but I think compassionate justice. Think of Jesus with the woman caught in adultery. Don't get me started on the fact that she's the only one that's brought there, but he highlights the fact that nobody there is without sin. He doesn't excuse her sin in some respects. He tells her to go and not sin in that way anymore. But he is compassionate in seeing that that isn't the whole of who she is or the whole of her story. So the priests were expected to be concerned about justice. It's part of their priestly role. It's part of their worship is to be the ones that stand at the city gate and hear when there is someone seeking sanctuary for them. One commentary suggested that also the priestly presence, them going into Levitical cities, was important because if if exiled from your own city, where do you go and seek sanctuary? You may go somewhere where there wasn't the opportunity for you to worship in the same way, but by going to one of the Levite cities, you would at least have access to continued worship and those who performed the worship. But it seems to me that it makes more sense that it's also just an expectation of God, that these people should have his heart. They're the Levites. They're the ones that should be leading the people, and so they should have the responsibility of hearing, of offering sanctuary, of protecting those people. It's worth saying we don't know if this worked. We don't have any stories, as far as I can tell in the Bible, that tell us that somebody went to a city of sanctuary and got sanctuary. It's the instruction, it's done. We don't actually know if it ever actually happened. But I want you to imagine for a minute a killing, an accidental killing in the time of Joshua. Somebody's killed, and somebody is saying, it was a complete accident. I was trying to think of an imaginary accident that could happen where that would be the case, and I couldn't think of one. So let's just imagine an accidental death has happened. Now we would have forensics come in. If you watch any of the crime dramas that are on, you'll know the blue overalls and the blue shoes and the little markers that show where things are and all the rest of it. They had no forensic scientists. But even forensic scientists can't know somebody's intent. They can't get into somebody's mind and know what the intent was. But imagine that happening then when there are no police, nobody to try and ascertain the details, and somebody is stood saying, it was an accident. Imagine the emotion for the rest of that community when they see somebody, maybe somebody who's the breadwinner for that family, and at that time, that could mean destitution for a family. Perhaps it's a member of the family that is the sole person who creates the food that's able to farm. Perhaps it's the one that nurtures and looks after the family. The awful emotion of the loss, and in the midst of that, them being expected to hear somebody saying, but I didn't do it on purpose. If anyone's ever been involved in a high kind of level argument, it's really hard to hear the other side when your emotions are running high. God knows us. God knows that that's the case. And so God gives a solution. God offers space. A way of the person being heard. Their story being heard and taken seriously by people outside of the situation because they are in a different city. And by people who should have God's heart and God's wisdom because they are the ones that lead the worship. And God sets a time limit as well on that person being exiled until the high priest dies. Now it strikes me that this allows time for the community from which they have left to grieve, to acknowledge their loss and to grieve, and to process the story of what has happened. Part of justice is knowing what happened. But also for the person that sought sanctuary to grieve and to acknowledge all their emotions, to come to terms with what has happened. And it's suggested that also the high priest had a function of kind of carrying the people's sins. And so when he died, it's almost like the slate being wiped clean. Sound familiar? High priest, death, sins wiped clean. But so at that point, that person's level, and any sin or guilt that is there is wiped clean, and so he can return back and be re-established in his community. Now, I want to tell you a story about when I was younger, and it's very, very minor in what happened, but it had a significant impact on me. When I was about 6 and I was first at school, so it's probably year 1, maybe. I don't remember that far back in terms of the detail. I was wrongfully accused of something. Now, as a 6-year-old, I was one of those 6-year-olds that if I saw something wrong, I would go and tell somebody that it was wrong. And I saw a couple of children, probably a year or 2 older than me, in the corridor where there was this display done by the infant school, and they were throwing some of it around. Now, the little 6-year-old me went to tell them to stop. And they ignored me, shockingly. The thing is, at that point, a teacher came down the corridor. And the teacher saw 6-year-old me and 2 7 or 8-year-olds. What they saw was the 3 of us trashing this display. The teacher made the assumption we were all involved. And in hindsight, that was a fair assumption to make. So, despite my protests, that I was only there trying to stop them both from doing it, she took us all to the head teacher. And despite me telling the head teacher, I was trying to stop them from doing it, I was not heard. I was not taken seriously. And so I was given the same punishment as the others, which was to go and tidy up the display and apologise to the nursery. Now, I was angry and hurt and frustrated that at no point did my story get heard. I wasn't taken seriously when I said that I wasn't involved. I can totally understand as an adult why I wasn't, but as a child, you can imagine the impact that had. Interestingly, I never told my parents. I think perhaps my trust that I would be heard and taken seriously was so eroded by the teacher and the head teacher, I figured that no one would believe me. And so I gave up trying to get that justice. It has impacted me, not in a massive way, in one way, but in another way, because now I try really hard. I fail, but I try really hard, and I tried really hard when our children were little, to hear the other person's story, to not assume that what it looked like was exactly what was going on. If I saw one of my kids clobber the other one, I didn't assume that they were the first one or that there wasn't more to it than that. I tried. There were times when that worked and there were times that it didn't. But it had an impact on me as well in terms of justice, in terms of recognizing that there is a story, and are we willing to take seriously the story? That's not to excuse the actions, but to recognize that there is a story. Justice is God's concern, and God makes it his holy people's concern. And it should be our concern. And compassionate justice, I would suggest, means seeing the person beyond the assumptions and labels, hearing them and taking their story seriously. Now, not all stories are true. I could have, as a 6-year-old, been telling a lie to try and get away with something. So it takes discernment. And again, God meets us at where we need. God says to them, this isn't about one person making a decision. It's about a group of people hearing that story together. These cities of sanctuary were intended, I'm sure, to prevent an escalation of bloodshed and violence and to set clear boundaries for living in peace. After all life is precious. There is something about the killing of others that has an impact on all, not just all people, but all creation. In Genesis 4, we have Cain killing Abel. And God says to Cain, "Your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." And goes on to tell him that it will be harder toil for him with the ground now, and he will be exiled from his home. We use poppies as a sign of remembrance because after the bloodshed and violence that tore up the land, poppies grew, because poppies thrive on ground that has been turned over and disturbed. The land is still scarred by the wars. We had the privilege of going a few years ago on a battlefields trip that visited Belgium and France. It was incredibly moving, but the thing that struck me were the places where the land is still scarred from a war 80 years ago. All creation is affected by violence and death. Remembrance is about us remembering the horrible cost of war. It's not about glorifying it, but recognizing the awfulness of it. And part of that is by necessity the dehumanizing of the other. We went to see a film last night, and if you've seen it promoted, The Choral, great film, and it's a story of a choral society during the war. And they're trying to find something to sing. And they're hitting upon a problem. And the problem they're hitting upon is everything that they know that they can sing is written by a German composer. And every time someone comes up with another suggestion, the conductor says, German. But we know this one really well, German. And it really struck me that only a few years before that wouldn't have been an issue. But now it had become an issue because they were at war. And so somebody had designated them enemies and labelled them such. War and violence dehumanizes the other. I don't want to go into lots of political detail about what's going on in the world at the moment, what happened in Sheffield yesterday, but just to say that God is concerned with justice And part of justice is us not labelling the other. So we need to take care that we have that concern too. Jesus saw people. There's a fantastic poem about the woman at the well encountering Jesus, and it says, to be known is to be loved, and to be loved is to be known. And there is something about being known, and that Jesus knew people. He saw them. He saw beyond the labels that had been put on her and the narrative that had been projected onto her. He saw Zacchaeus up a tree, and he saw beyond the role that he inhabited in society and saw the person. He spoke the truth and challenged injustices. He challenged, for example, where people were excluded from healing. Jesus cares about justice. We are fortunate, I would suggest today, in that we do have legal systems. We also have cities like Sheffield that are cities of sanctuary. I am so proud to be in a city of sanctuary, I have to say. I know that there are people and individuals, perhaps even here, who open their doors to people seeking asylum and have them live with them. We have a friend who does just that. There are churches that have been known to be places of sanctuary. But I want to suggest that it's not just about having places of sanctuary, but us being people of sanctuary. Of us being people who allow people to be heard, to looking beyond labels and assumptions and narratives that are attached to people. And I speak personally, that can be really uncomfortable. We're in an area where there is a massive amount of diversity, and with that comes all sorts of social challenges. And so having conversations with people that have very different political views to me, but seeking to understand where they come from. I have people that have very, very different attitudes towards women than me, trying to understand where they come from. When I see someone who looks different to me, treating them just the same as anybody else. Seeing beyond the labels and assumptions that I carry means that I can possibly offer them a moment of sanctuary where they can be themselves. I believe God cares about justice, and God cares about people's stories. Jesus did too. And so we are called to care about justice, to offer sanctuary to people. And I want to finish with a thing that you will all know because it is so often quoted, but for good reason. Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.